invention and evolution of the telephone. And this is a really interesting subject. Obviously, today telephones are important to all of us. It's something we can hardly live without, but it wasn't always that way. And the story behind how we came to have telephones in our pockets is an interesting one. So, this, of course, is a picture of Alexander Graham Bell. Bell is the name that is most often or most commonly associated with the development of the telephone. Most people would probably know his name. But when you dig down into the history of the telephone, you discover that there are actually quite a lot of people who deserve credit for getting this invention up and running. And I think one of the most interesting things is how many people in different parts of the world were actually working on similar inventions, similar devices at roughly the same time. And I know that there have actually been books written about this kind of thing, like how is it possible that so many people in different places who were not even in contact uh, would come to some of the same ideas. And of course, it has to do with the development of the technology that they're working with and so on and so forth. And we won't get into all that, but it is very interesting to know how far and wide these kinds of ideas were at the time. So this is just a slide that shows you a lot of the people who were working on various types of inventions or in types of experiments that would ultimately contribute to the development of devices like the telephone or even things that would contribute to um, Alexander Graham Bell's invention. So Alexander Graham Bell is in the middle, right? He's small here because I want to focus on all of these other people. So you can see we've got a couple of people like Innocenzo Manzetti and Antonio Meucci, I guess, who are Italian. And then we have other people who we have some Americans, we have somebody from Hungary. So it's just interesting. All of these people, you can see the dates. They were roughly working in the same period on some devices that are part of this larger story. So let's talk first about some of these other people, some of these lesser known figures who were involved in the development of the telephone in some capacity. And you'll see why I'm sort of qualifying my statement because I can't say that everything is a direct link, but they all sort of were working in the same kind of idea space, right? So the first one I want to talk about is Innocenzo Manzetti. He was an Italian inventor, and in 1840, he created a flute playing automaton. I think this is fascinating. I was excited to find a photograph of it. So this was an automaton in the shape of a man, obviously. It was life size. It was seated on a chair, and hidden inside the chair were levers and connecting rods and some compressed air tubes, which made the automaton's lips and fingers move on a flute according to a program that was recorded on the cylinder. So this is sort of like the same idea behind player pianos, right? You have a cylinder with these pieces that are raised so that the keys or the pieces of metal, right, strike those parts of the cylinder and it makes the music. So that's basically the way this worked as well. The automaton was powered by a clockwork system and it could perform 12 different arias. And as part of the performance, at the end, it would even stand, bow its head, and its eyes could move. So I think this is so interesting that it's such an early time. And I know other stories, by the way, of other automatons that were being invented in even the late 1700s, early 1800s. So I know this is not the only one. But this one is directly connected or has been linked to kind of the development of the telephone because Manzetti worked on this, and then he started suggesting that maybe there was a possibility of taking this kind of idea and using it to transmit the human voice. Um, so in the mid 1860s, he began to develop what many believe to be sort of the first prototype of a telephone. And of course, this is years before Alexander Graham Bell would ultimately file the patent for his device. Um, in 1865, Manzetti reportedly spoke about the concept of transmitting voice over electrical wires, and he even demonstrated something called a speaking telegraph to local audiences. And his device could carry sound over wires using a similar method to modern telephones, something called electromagnetic induction. So many, for this reason, have seen this as being like one of the first real devices created that would become a telephone, that was like a telephone. Now, the next person we'll talk about is Antonio Meucci. So he was also an Italian inventor. And in 1849, he developed a device through which one could hear the sound of a human voice. It wasn't clear, so it's been described as an inarticulate human voice, but you could hear something. He called his device the telegrafo parlante, the talking telegraph. Now, Meucci moved to Staten Island, New York, eventually, and there he continued to study the principles of electromagnetic voice transmission. And he did this for many years, and he was able to transmit his own voice through wires in 1856. And he even installed a device in his home that was a sort of a telephone-like device. And he did this because his wife was ill, and he created this so he could communicate with her from a different part of the house when she was bedridden. Now, Meucci submitted something called a patent caveat for his telephonic device to the U.S. Patent Office in 1871. And a caveat was like a provisional patent application. So it was an application with drawings and a description, but without yet the request for examination. So in some ways, if you can think of it, it was sort of like a holding place. You know, like I've got this invention that I am creating. Here are the drawings. Here's a description of it, but I'm not quite ready to have a demonstration for the patent office, but I want to sort of claim my space for this. I want to claim territory for this idea. But of course, until you complete the process, you don't own the idea, right? The idea can't be patented. So what happened in this case is Meucci filed the caveat, and he actually renewed it a couple of times. But then at some point he couldn't afford to pay the fee to keep doing that, and so he let it expire. All right, the next person we're going to talk about is a man named Philip Reis. So Reis was a German, or Reis maybe, was a German scientist and inventor. And in 1861, he constructed the first device there to transmit a voice via electronic signals. And again, some people refer to this as maybe the first telephone. He also coined the term telephone, apparently. Well, he's given credit for that. Now, he had difficulty getting people in Germany interested in his invention. He did do demonstrations of it and did so to some scientists as well, but no one seemed to appreciate the possibilities of this device, at least not where he was presenting it. And ultimately, he died in 1874 without ever being able to do anything with his invention. And I think this is interesting when we think about technology today, how often we see things being promoted or launched or discussed. And, some of us think, and I'm a little bit of a, I won't say I'm a technophobe. I just don't love learning new technology necessarily. So I have like zero interest in or what do they call the glasses where you can see things. I have zero interest in these kinds of devices, right? But there are some people who see something like that and immediately imagine all of the possibilities. And so when we go back in time and we look at the development of inventions like this, we see the same thing. We see some people who look at something like this, look at a drawing like this or look at an example, and immediately their brains start going about all of the possible ways that this could be used. And then there are some people who look at it and think like, what would I do with that? And so they just don't appreciate it. And so unfortunately, in some cases, if there isn't a group of people who are willing to get on board with this, the project might stop, right? Because then you have to have money and you have to have the know-how and you have to have the money, but you also have to have people interested usually for your invention to really take off. And so we see here's an example of someone who couldn't find the interest. And so, things sort of stalled for him. All right, the next person is Elisha Gray. So Gray, of course, is an American. He's best known for his development of another telephone prototype. This took place in 1876 in Highland Park, Illinois. Now, some recent authors have argued that Gray should be considered the true inventor of the telephone because they claim that Alexander Graham Bell stole an idea from Gray. And specifically, what it was something called a liquid transmitter. And Gray had been experimenting with liquid transmitters and using them in his telephone experiments for more than 2 years before Bell filed his patent. But we'll get to that in a little bit. So in the 1860s, Gray was experimenting with the telegraph, and he formed a company that supplied equipment to the Western Union Telegraph Company. So again, it makes sense that these things would be connected, right? But in 1874, he decided to retire so he could focus his time on research and development. On Monday morning, February 14th, 1876, Gray signed and had notarized the caveat that described a telephone that used a liquid transmitter, and he submitted that caveat to the U.S. Patent Office. Now, remember, the caveat is just sort of like the holding document, right? It has drawings and it has a description, but it's not ready for a demonstration yet. Now, that same morning, this is amazing, right? The same morning, February 14th, 1876, a lawyer for Alexander Graham Bell submitted his patent application. Now, it's always been kind of hotly debated which one of these documents arrived in the office first. Of course, Gray believed that his caveat arrived several hours before Bell's application. Now, there's another piece of the story, though. Bell's lawyers in Washington, D.C. had his patent application all ready to go, but they'd been waiting to file it for months. And these instructions came directly from Bell because he needed to file it in Great Britain first before he filed it in the United States. And the reason is because at that time, Great Britain would only issue patents on devices that had not previously been patented elsewhere. So if all of these facts are correct, right, Bell has had his patent application, and presumably then that means he had a telephone that was ready to demonstrate months before Gray would have submitted that caveat. But the only reason that Bell had not submitted his earlier is because he was waiting to hear from the British Patent Office. Once he had that one, then he was ready to go with the American, and that's why it was filed on the same day as Gray. So although Bell has been accused of stealing the telephone from Gray, because his liquid transmitter design resembled Gray's, Documents in the Library of Congress indicate that actually Bell had been using liquid transmitters in his designs for 3 years, both in his telegraph designs and in other experiments. So, given those two pieces of evidence, the fact that the patent application had been completed for several months, and the fact that we know from these Library of Congress documents that Bell had also been using liquid transmitters, it seems fair to say that the supporters of Gray are probably incorrect, right? And one can understand why Gray would have been upset to discover that Bell beat him to the punch on this, beat him to the finish line. And it is remarkable that the two men were filing these on the same day, nonetheless. But it does sound like Bell probably got there first. Now, in April of 17, let's see. Okay, so Gray challenged Bell's patent anyway, though, because he did feel like he had gotten there first, and it resulted in 2 years of litigation, but ultimately Bell was awarded the rights to the invention. So in the end, legally, he was given the title of, or the credit as the inventor of the telephone. So let's talk then about Alexander Graham Bell. So here are two pictures of him, a younger picture of him and an older picture of him. I think he looks to be quite a handsome man. Even his older picture, he's quite handsome. So let's talk about him. So he was born in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1847. And even as a child, he showed a lot of curiosity and talent for creativity and invention that would sort of predict his later interests. When he was only 12 years old, his mother began to lose her hearing, and so he became keenly interested in understanding sound and acoustics. In fact, his whole family had a history of being associated with the teaching of elocution. His father had actually published several works on elocution, and his father also taught methods to instruct people who at that time were known as deaf mutes, so people who couldn't hear or speak. We don't use that term anymore, I realize, but back in the day, they called them deaf mutes. So his father actually taught methods to teach deaf mutes to articulate words and also to read other people's lip movements. So his father was sort of like an instructor who helped other people teach people who could not hear how to read lips and also make sounds that sounded like speech, right? So even before his mother began to go deaf himself, Alexander already sort of had knowledge and experience with the whole concept of communicating sound. When he was 16, his father took him and his brothers to see an automaton, not the one we spoke of before, but a different one. This was a rudimentary mechanical man that simulated a human voice. And Bell was fascinated by this machine, and he began to read the work of the machine's creator. Before long, he and his brother decided that they would build their own automaton head. And they eventually produced a remarkably lifelike head that could actually sort of speak a few words. I'll put that in quotation marks. So it could make sounds that sounded like human words. Now, during this period of time, Bell, the younger Bell, was already working as an instructor of elocution. So he had already begun to work with deaf students himself. In 1870, however, a tragedy struck the Bell family. Both of his brothers died of tuberculosis. And both because of that and because of their father's illness, the elder Bell, they decided to move to Canada. They thought it would be better for everyone's health. So they settled in Ontario, and Alexander continued to work on his studies of the human voice and acoustics. Specifically, he began to work with the idea of sound, and electricity. Now, the following year, Alexander's father was offered a job with the Boston School for Deaf Mutes. He turned down the job, but he handed the opportunity to his son Alexander instead. And so Alexander went to work at this Boston School for Deaf Mutes. And then a year later, Alexander actually opened his own school. While he was doing this, however, he was also working as a private tutor. Now, as we've already seen, throughout his life, Bell had sought to help deaf people assimilate into speaking society. And he was very interested in speech therapy. He was very interested in lip reading, and he also was interested in sign language. One of his students actually was Helen Keller. So I'm sure all of you know who Helen Keller is. What you might not know is that Helen Keller grew up in Tuscumbia, Alabama. And her home, which is about 3 hours north of me, is a little museum. And you can visit that museum, and they have the original water pump where the story is that Helen Keller finally sort of like figured out what her teacher was trying to tell her when she was trying to spell out the word water. So if you grew up hearing of Helen Keller, if you ever watched that famous black and white movie, you can go to this house and you can see the setting, you can see the actual pump, you can see the actual dining room where Anne Sullivan tried to teach Helen Keller to sit at a table and use utensils instead of just wandering around eating off of everyone else's plate. So I very much urge you, if you're interested in this topic, to watch that movie. It's called The Miracle Worker. It's a really good movie. And then if you ever get a chance to come here, it's worth going to that museum. I thought it was quite moving, having seen the movie myself and just appreciating what Helen Keller went through and what she ultimately would be able to achieve with her life. Anyway, that was a sidebar. But so one of his students was Helen Keller. Another student was a woman named Mabel, and this woman would ultimately become his wife. So she had lost her hearing at the age of 5 after a near fatal case of scarlet fever. When Alexander met her, she was 15 and he was 25, which is maybe problematic by today's standards, but we know that in that time it wasn't the same. But they did not marry until she was 19. So actually, it's not clear when their relationship started, but when she was 15, they started working together, and then 4 years later they got married. Ultimately, they would have 4 children together. And this is a picture of Alexander Graham Bell's family on the left here. Obviously, only 2 kids there, so that is his wife, Mabel. So during the next few years, Mabel was Alexander's inspiration to continue to develop ways of transmitting the human voice. Then in 1874, Bell met Thomas Watson. Watson was an experienced electrical designer and mechanic at an electric machine shop. So Bell hired Watson as his assistant, and the two completed their design for the telephone. And as we've already seen, they filed the patent in February, and on March 7th, they received that patent, much to the dismay of Elisha Gray, who had also been working on the telephone. And 3 days later, on March 10th, Bell succeeded in getting his telephone to work using a liquid transmitter similar to the one in Gray's design. When Bell spoke that sentence, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," into the liquid transmitter, Watson, who was listening at the receiving end in an adjoining room, heard the words clearly. Now, after March 1876, Bell began a series of public demonstrations of the telephone. He began to give lectures to introduce this new invention to the scientific community, as well as the general public. Not long after, His demonstration of an early telephone prototype was seen at the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, and this really brought the telephone to international attention. The following year, in 1877, the Bell Telephone Company was created, and by about 10 years later, more than 150,000 people in the United States owned telephones. Of course, along the way, Bell engineers made numerous other improvements to the telephone, which emerged as one of the most successful products ever. In 1879, the company acquired Thomas Edison's patents for the carbon microphone from Western Union, and this made the telephone more practical for long distance use. And it was no longer necessary to shout when using the receiving telephone. Of course, other people contributed to the growth and continuing development of the telephone as well. So here's another one of those guys from that previous slide that we saw at the very beginning. So this man's name is, and I'm going to butcher it, I'm sure, he's Hungarian, Tivadar Puskás. He moved to the United States in the 1870s, and he was already working on an idea for a telephone exchange when Alexander Graham Bell was inventing the telephone. And so when Bell invented the telephone, this led him to kind of take a fresh look at his idea, and he decided to get in touch with Thomas Edison. And he began to then perfect his idea to build a telephone exchange. Basically, this device that would allow wires to connect many different telephones, right? And according to Thomas Edison said Tivadar Puskás was the first person to suggest the idea of a telephone exchange. And these first ideas were put into practice and built by the Bell Telephone Company in Boston in 1877. You see some illustrations here of what those early exchange systems would look like. Now, the same year, the first permanent outdoor telephone wire was installed in Boston for a distance of about 3 miles. It stretched from Boston to a sort of suburb of Boston called Somerville, so about 3 miles distance. And then in 1915, we have the first transcontinental telephone call. So in January of 1915, Bell made the first ceremonial transcontinental telephone call. He called from the AT&T head office. The Bell Company became AT&T. The AT&T head office at 15 Day Street in New York City, and he was heard by Thomas Watson at the 333 Grant Avenue office in San Francisco. In the 1930s, the first rotary dial phones were introduced, allowing people to dial directly and to bypass operators. But of course, many homes still actually needed to contact operators to place calls for the remainder of that decade. How many of you remember a rotary dial phone? I certainly remember rotary dial phones from when I was growing up. And interestingly, as you guys probably have seen, now you can purchase these as kind of like a retro design choice if you want one in your home. If you have a landline, you could actually have one of these in your home now. All right. Now, of course, by the 1960s, touch tone dialing was introduced. That's the buttons, right? We all know that. And by this point, over 80% of American homes had a landline. So telephones became a marketing opportunity, and they became available in various colors and shapes. So there are lots of different kinds of telephones that were available. Obviously, you have sort of the standard box form here that came in different colors. You had the kind that was sort of like this, only not shaped like lips. It was called like the princess phone. You had all sorts of different options. This one looks like a hamburger. So once people all had a phone, it became an opportunity to make money, to come up with these different designs. They were particularly popular, of course, with teenagers and young people. Now, even as landlines were becoming commonplace, so that most homes in America had them, there were people who were already working on the concept of a commercially available mobile phone. So in 1946, we see the first commercial mobile phone service launched by AT&T and Southwestern Bell in St. Louis, Missouri. And you can see here is a photograph of that. It used the mobile telephone service, a radio telephone system that required a massive 80-pound transmitter to be bolted into the trunk of the automobile. Now, these 1946 car phones required a physical operator to connect calls, and it operated on a push to talk basis, meaning you had to hold down a button to speak and then you had to release it to listen. But you can imagine that this was pretty rare for most people. It was still something that would have been mostly an experiment at this time, right? Jump forward to 1984. So the closest thing to what we consider a mobile phone today appeared in 1984. Again, look at the size of this device, right? So Motorola, which is an American company based in Illinois, released this phone. It weighed 2.5 pounds, so pretty heavy, and it cost roughly $4,000 at the time, which is equivalent to about $12,000 today. It needed to be charged for 10 hours, and that only gave you 30 minutes of talk time. Now, of course, after this, cell phone development moved very quickly. So here are some cell phones that you will find familiar, right? You have here in the 1980s, 1990s, this gigantic phone. I certainly remember seeing these. They were quite heavy. Then we went to the 1990s with flip phones. Here, 1996, the first Nokia telephone allowed access to the web. Whoops, sorry, I was trying to move this. And then down here you see 2000, right? Nokia comes out with something that's a little bit smaller, and maybe more closely resembles a modern cell phone. And then finally, in 2007, Apple launches the first iPhone. Some of you, if you're old enough, you'll remember seeing a lot of these. And certainly if you watch movies that are set in the past, you'll see some of these older phones, right? Obviously, telephones are an essential part of life today, and we can't live without them. They're important for business, of course. Of course, they connect people across the world, as we can see. You can find a picture of pretty much everyone with a cell phone. I love this picture of the Pope with the cell phone. I had a picture somewhere that I took in Moscow of a Russian Orthodox priest with a cell phone, but I couldn't find it. I was going to put that in here. But obviously, cell phones today are just absolutely ubiquitous. And even people who can't afford other things will figure out a way to get a cell phone because it's almost an essential thing that you have to have these days just to operate. In many places now, it's required to have a cell phone. It's expected to have a cell phone to access information. You can do all of your banking on your cell phone. You can pay bills on your cell phone. You can shop on your cell phone. When you go to a restaurant, they'll have a QR code, and you use your cell phone to access the QR code. Of course, this is kind of a problem for some people because people like, the age of my parents who are in their 80s don't know how to use QR codes. And so there is there is some resistance, I think, to going completely that direction recognizing that there's at least one or two maybe at least one generation of people who are not quite ready for that. But cell phones are everywhere now, and you can't really operate without a phone. And of course, the best thing about phones is the way they allow us to communicate. So, um, when I was in Russia doing my dissertation research, the first time I had no access to a phone, I had to go to the Central Telegraph office to place a phone call to call home to talk to my husband or my parents. Um, by the time, the last time I was there, of course, I had a cell phone with me. I could FaceTime anybody I wanted to. And now both of my children live in other cities. And so we use FaceTime and we all get together and watch movies. So we'll pull up a movie on Netflix, and then all three of us will click at the same time and start the movie, and then we'll watch a movie together. So the phone allows us to almost be in the same room with people, or to have the feeling of being in the same room with people. And its value for human connection is probably even more important than some of the other things that we've talked about today. And I want to end that with a little playing this clip of this song. Um, it's one that I was recently introduced to, so I don't know if you'll have heard it, but I thought it was perfect to end this talk with. So let me just click on this. Sorry.
I think you can post it in the chat. Riley, I'm sorry, we can't see your YouTube
You
page.
can't?
No, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
can you hear
Maybe
it?
you can post it into the chat.
Can you hear it? Could you hear the song?
No.
No,
Oh,
you're not sharing the sound. The sound would
oh,
have to be shared.
okay. I'm sorry. All right. I don't know how to do that then. Okay, let me go to the chat room. All right. Sorry about that, folks. I thought I could share that with you and it didn't work. Let's see. All right. So what are some of the comments? Let's see. Okay. What was the decisive factor that turned the telephone into a household device other than just a business one? Um, so I would guess that it was money, honestly. Once people realize the value of the device for business, I'm sure that they recognize that,